Hello. So, picking up from the end of World War II. How does World War II end? Well, actually, there's some dispute about the precise date for when World War II ended because there were lots of different conflicts between lots of different powers. And so you kind of have to look at which treaties were signed when. But the key dates that you should probably be aware of, on the 8th of May, the German government signed an unconditional surrender with the invading forces. And that's following Adolf Hitler's suicide on the 30th of April. However, the war in the Pacific theatre with Japan continues into August, and it's in August that you get the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, following which there's an unconditional surrender from Japan. Some of the treaties aren't actually signed until September, and in fact there are some powers that still haven't signed treaties, but we can basically say from August World War II is over. So, within Europe, the occupying powers, the USSR, USA, UK and France, joined to form something called the Allied Control Council for sharing the governance and administration of Germany while they work out what they're going to do. And they've got this temporary division that's been agreed at Potsdam, whereby each of them controls one part of Germany and each of them also controls 1/4 of Berlin. Berlin, importantly remember, is deep within the Eastern Zone. So that's all kind of how it is to begin with. Part of the problem is, not only are there different ideologies between the four powers, there are really also very different wartime experiences which inform very different expectations for the best way of how to treat Germany going forward. So, Russia, represented here by the bear from Masha and the Bear, had suffered by some considerable margin the most significant war losses. And so, perhaps understandably, has two primary concerns. One, security. They never, ever, ever want to experience an invasion like that again, which clearly, one can understand. And two, reparations. They want to be compensated for their losses, both economically and, for justice, if you like, for revenge. And so they are really, really clear that what they want is Germany to be absolutely economically flattened, to pay huge amounts of reparations back to them as by way of compensation. And they also want, and have managed to secure by the end of World War II, control over those countries in Central and Eastern Europe between Germany and the USSR to ensure that what they would have called like buffer states are in place to prevent a future invasion from Germany. Of the three Western powers, France is probably the closest to the USSR's position, which, when you think about it, as the only one of those three that had actually been occupied, perhaps makes sense. They're not quite as hell-bent on destroying Germany as the USSR, perhaps, because actually, despite there are many atrocities occur in France, but it's not on the scale of what happens in the USSR. They do want reparations, but they're probably not quite as hell-bent on absolutely destroying Germany. The UK and the USA, their positions evolve. There's a diversity of thought both within the State Department, the American Foreign Office, and the British Foreign Office. By and large, though, and especially as time goes by and the real threat presented by Russia manifests itself, the priorities are, for Britain particularly, to get Germany to become economically self-reliant, because Britain is now in a serious economic difficulty and can't afford to keep sending in the money and the food that they're having to do so to keep their sector afloat. And also for trade. They want Germany to be restored as a trading partner. And then America has that in their thinking, and both countries are also very, very increasingly concerned about the influence of the USSR and the fact that in two ways communism might spread if Germany is not strengthened. Number one, if Germany is extremely poor and people are feeling hopeless and like they don't have any kind of future, they're more likely to vote in communists because it proposes radical change and freer, more equal distribution of wealth. And two, actually, even before you even get to elections or anything like that, there's a real risk that if Germany remains weak, it'll be easier for Russia to do what she's been doing in Eastern and Central Europe. I've actually left this chap out of it. We'll bring America back in a minute, to bring in puppet governments and start to kind of effectively militarily take over. So we've got those different perspectives. 4 priorities are agreed, though, by the ACC, the Allied Control Commission, and pursued with varying degrees of vigour and success in the 4 zones. They're the 4 Ds. Democratisation, bringing in free and fair elections, which happens to varying degrees as you might expect. Decentralisation, which goes all too well because the whole country ends up being split. There's a sense that actually the reason that Hitler manages to bring in such dramatic change so quickly is because actually he takes away the power from the regional assemblies in the Länder, so the kind of the Bavarias and the Saxonies, and the power needs to be redistributed around the country. Demilitarisation, which absolutely works because the Germans are denied an army for the best part of a decade, and then Denazification. And it's the Denazification process which has kind of mixed levels of success, particularly. Initially, there's a sense anyone who's ever been an active Nazi needs to be prosecuted, needs to be, at the very least, investigated and kind of, check that they're fit to go back into society. It proves incredibly difficult because, of course, how do you tell who's a really passionate, ideologically motivated, absolutely convicted Nazi, as opposed to, say, someone who wanted to keep their job as a teacher, so joined the Nazi Teaching Association because if you didn't, you were likely to lose your job. So the Nuremberg trials go ahead, which trial the kind of most senior leading Nazis, but the kind of wider denazification process ends up being kind of halted. So, April 1945, Walter Ulbricht, pretty quickly, so this is before Germany has even properly surrendered, shows up in Berlin. Who is Walter Ulbricht? Walter Ulbricht is a German communist who has spent the latter years of World War II in Moscow with the Russians, training and preparing for this moment. He is an extremely, I've lost the word that I'm trying to find, it's because we're convicted, it's not convicted, I said that before, but he has great conviction as a communist, and he sincerely believes that the only way forward, that the most moral and just and politically wise way forward is now for Germany to become a communist state. And he has been training with the communists in Moscow for the tactics that he's going to employ, that are being employed across Eastern and Central Europe, for creating an impression of democracy and I can hear a child crying in the background, but it's fine, someone else is dealing with it. Creating an impression of democracy and... Now, it's actually the Soviet zone that is the very first zone to announce any legislation for the recreation of free political parties. It's one of the first orders that the Soviet military administration, SMAD, puts out, and it certainly gives the impression that the Russians really have honoured the agreements they made at Potsdam and Yalta, and they're really going to allow for a development of a free, fair, democratic society in East Germany. That's precisely the impression they want to give, and it's precisely not what they're planning to do at all. It's about buying time. It's about kind of creating a false sense of security amongst precisely the people who might have tried to stop them had it been really clear what they are up to. And it's absolutely insincere. Because actually the following year, one of the key further moves that they do is the creation of the SED. And in English, that's the Socialist Unity Party. So in April 1946, the Socialist Party of Germany and the Communist Party of Germany in the Eastern Zone, importantly this doesn't happen in the Western zones, so in the Soviet zone, are merged. And they merge through, there is a ballot of all members and it's agreed to, but the Socialist Party that are balloted, it's not a free or particularly private fair vote, and there's a huge campaign of intimidation, of blackmail, of violence, and so you no longer have an independent socialist party after this. You've just got this Socialist Unity Party. Why? Why do they do this? Effectively, it's a means of destroying the Socialist Party as a potential rival on the left that might take left-leaning voters' votes away from the communists. And actually, it's not the Socialist Unity Party at all, because pretty rapidly, once you've got the Socialist Unity Party created, all of the socialist members of that party are purged. So they're, bullied into resigning or just taken away from their posts or, goodness knows what else. And so what you actually end up with is a communist party, renamed the Socialist Unity Party, that's absolutely loyal to Ulbricht, and a non-existent socialist party. And bit by bit, and we'll talk about this a bit more when we look at the lessons on the formation of political structures in East Germany, all the other so-called free political parties are kind of brought into line, and it becomes really quite apparent by 1949 latest that there is absolutely no diverse, no healthy, no remotely legitimately democratic structures of democracy in East Germany whatsoever. It's all controlled by the SED, which is all controlled by Walter Ulbricht, who is directly loyal to Stalin in Moscow. So that's what's going on over there. The East Zone is also seeing under the Russians a huge amount of asset stripping, of reparations being taken on a scale that individual factories are being dismantled brick by brick, put on trains and taken back. Skilled people such as engineers, any German technical experts that they think are particularly helpful for their economy are literally kidnapped and taken back to Russia to help to rebuild the economy. And a very different approach is starting to emerge in the Western zones, where, with the exception of France, that starts to be coming around, the view is increasingly towards getting Germany back on its feet. The winter of 46-47 across Europe is a particularly bitter one. Huge kind of problems to do with malnourishment and sickness and all the rest of it across Europe. And actually, the cost of the food imports and just the general resources that they're having to bring in the Western zones is such that it becomes apparent first to the British and the Americans that they need to be cooperating more closely. Ultimately, the French agree to this as well, and we see the creation of Bizonia, the merging of the British and American zones to that end in January 47, ultimately becoming Trizonia, incorporating the French zone in April 1949. Both of these moves are incredibly negatively perceived by Stalin, who sees them, not unfairly, as steps towards not just greater cooperation but getting Germany back on her feet economically, which they perceive as an enormous threat. Now, in 1947, the British government informs President Harry S. Truman of the USA that they can no longer afford to keep funding the Greek government in their civil war. Well, it's called the Greek Civil War, but as they see it, as their resistance of the Greek communists' attempts to take their government by coup. And in fact, Greece is very much at the front line, if you think about where it is geographically, of the Soviet-controlled Eastern Bloc now. The surrounding nations have very much come under Moscow's control, and there is a real sense in the State Department, particularly in the White House, that the time has now come to start a policy of containment, of not allowing Soviet influence to spread any further. There is some resistance to doing very much about this within the USA, within Congress in particular. There is a strong isolationist trend in American foreign policy and public feeling. Then actually, this is the second, we've had 2 world wars that were started in Europe where our young men died. Actually, we're doing all right now. Why would we want to get involved in any of this whatsoever? In June 1947, General George C. Marshall, on behalf of the American government, makes a fact-finding visit to Europe. And he comes back and reports that actually they're going to need something in the region of $17 billion of aid to prevent them collapsing. And the fear being that if they do collapse, either through the ballot box or at the foot of the Red Army, they're going to go communist one way or another. And still, the American public, Congress, are not completely convinced. And it's not until March 1948 when Jan Masaryk, who is the last remaining non-communist politician in the Czechoslovakian government. Czechoslovakia at that time was one country, it wasn't the Czech Republic and Slovakia now, is found dead, having apparently committed suicide, but with strong suggestions that the fall from his window was more kind of facilitated than perhaps initiated. That there is a real sense of urgency in the American government that actually, okay, it becomes apparent that really the communist influence is spreading with ruthless tactics that need to be resisted. So $17 billion of aid is granted to the Western European nations through the European Relief Programme, which becomes known as the Marshall Aid or Marshall Programme. Marshall Plan. So the aid is offered to all countries in Europe, including actually the USSR. Clearly the USSR are never going to take it because it's the ultimate humiliation. It would look like they were dependent on America. It's just not what's going to happen. And they also refuse to allow any of the nations within their sphere of influence to take any of it. They refer to Marshall aid, to the Marshall Plan, as dollar imperialism. and see it purely as a way of buying influence and buying control. And, you know, to some degree, there is an element of self-interest in it. I think it's probably best described as doing well by doing good. I'll find who came up with that quote, because it's not mine. I'll put it in the comments. About 70% of the aid is given in a form that means that the countries are going to buy from American suppliers, and there are lots of kind of conditions placed on it. For example, in French cinemas, they have to show an increased number of American films. You know, this isn't totally altruistic, but it is enormously helpful for getting the British and other Western European nations' economies back on their feet, and very, very gratefully received. What it also does, of course, is further accentuate the divisions between West and Eastern Europe. Truman actually makes a statement that becomes known as the Truman Doctrine, in which, in 1947, he says that America will come to the aid of any country that is threatened by a foreign power. He doesn't say by communism or by the USSR, but it's clear what he means. And this is the policy of containment, of preventing communism from pushing back any further. And again, taken within the USSR in Moscow by Stalin as a further statement of hostility. Now, back in Bizonia, plans continue afoot. So the British and the Americans are increasingly working to make Germany not as financially dependent on them, because particularly for Britain it's becoming an unmanageable cost, but also they want to be strengthening the country because Germany really is the front line in Central Europe against the massive kind of Soviet sphere of influence, and they want to make sure that she's a strengthened nation. So one of the suggestions that they do put to the Soviet administration, to SMAD, is for some currency reform. The German economy in all zones has been massively besieged by inflation, and there's a huge percentage of the economy is on the black market or through the barter economy. It's not efficient for growth, it's not efficient for business. And so they make a proposal to the Soviets this is the Western zones governments, for some currency reform, for kind of relaunching the economy on a fairer, clearer footing with a new currency. The Soviets aren't interested, but in June 1948, the Western zones go ahead and launch their currency anyway. Now, it's the unilateral nature of this move that particularly angers Stalin. They're going ahead, they're doing it without, well, they had consulted, but they don't tell him that they're going to go ahead without him. But also the fact that not only are they doing something without cooperating with him, they're doing something which is going to strengthen Germany. And highly understandably, we haven't really used these people very much yet, have we? But we're going to. Highly understandably, Stalin is really, really angered by this and left feeling incredibly threatened. Potentially much less understandably, he therefore reacts by cutting off all... I had big plans for this, but anyway. Road, canal. I was promised a train, but I've not been brought a train. And rail access into Berlin. His plan is that if he can stop all access from the Western zones in Germany into Western Berlin, all the coal they need to deliver, all the food, all the general supplies, that he can starve the West Berliners into submission, and basically they might just leave him alone and let West Berlin kind of just merge into his zone. He also cuts off all electricity supplies and launches a huge propaganda campaign against the British, American and French government, saying that they have totally gone against all the deals and all the rest of it. West Berlin is incredibly anxious. They've got limited supplies left of food, limited supplies left of coal, and their electricity has been cut off. What's going to happen? Well, what happens is that between June 1948 and May 1949, you just can't buy this kind of technology. The British, American, French, Australian, New Zealand and South African air forces undertake one of the most, I can't really think of a paralleled programme of air-delivered aid to ensure that at no point does West Berlin go with insufficient coal or food or general supplies. It's an enormous effort. It's also a risky one. So they rely on the fact that at Yalta, 3 air corridors are agreed, and seeing as Stalin can't, block off the air, and actually were he to shoot down the planes, that would be an act of war. It's one thing within your own zone to cut off the canal, road and rail access, but to actually shoot down a plane would be an act of aggression. But also, you've got to remember that Air travel at this time is not as sophisticated as the world that we live in now, and actually over the course of this programme there is 101 fatalities. However, in the end, Stalin accepts that he has to give up and he calls off the blockade. But by this time, the Western Berliners have, and indeed Western Germany, seen it clearly evidenced that where Stalin's tactics are going to be kind of ruthless oppression and you know, cutting people off and trying to starve them into submission, the Western allies, admittedly partly for propaganda purposes, but also because strategically they don't want to be seen to be able to be bullied, will not let them down. And the impact on the positive relationship between West Berlin, West Germany and her fairly recent former enemies is huge. I think we can probably say that after the Berlin blockade and the Berlin Airlift, really almost entirely the Soviets have replaced the Germans in all of the Western allies, I'm not going to do these again, minds as enemy number one. Germany is now increasingly firmly in the Western camp, and it's the USSR that people are worried about. It's also clear that the relationship between the former allies has totally broken down. And in 1949, as we shall look at in our next session, 2 new states are declared.